Thank you, Corey, for having us. We are delighted to be here. My name is Kathy Wahl. I'm the director of the Inclusion Collaborative with Santa Clara County Office of Education, and we are here to share an overview with you on the Ways to Equity Playbook. And we call it the navigational tool to equitable schools, and we're going to share with you how to use it, or a little bit of overview information, and where you can get some more information. I did go ahead and put the link in the chat for you to get an online version. And again, thank you so much for being here. And I really appreciate that people are taking the time out today to do this. So today what we want to do is share what we did with our equity grant and how it's part of the state system-wide state system of support. And we want to give you an overview of the Ways to Equity Playbook and a little bit of its background, how to access and use the Ways to Equity Playbook. And then we have lots of tools and resources that we want to share with you and show you where they are located so you can access and use them on your own. So today, I am honored that all 5 of us are here today. We have 4 contributing authors with us today. Dr. Anna Marie Villalobos, raise your hand. And Kelly Wylie, raise your hand. And Dr. Angela Birts, yay. And Dr. Erica Boas, yay. And I'm Kathy Wahl. So we are delighted to have you here. Our emails are on the screen, and we will be sending this PowerPoint to Corey so that she can also upload it with the recording. So again, thank you to my esteemed colleagues for being here. Many of them, they all put in hours of work into the Ways to Equity Playbook and are considered equity warriors, as we like to call ourselves, but definitely experts in equities for specific student groups. So thank you all for being here and taking your time on a Monday afternoon. So I just wanted to share a little bit of overview that the Ways to Equity Playbook actually took about 2 years to actually develop. It was out of funding through the California Equity Performance Improvement Grant, which Santa Clara and San Diego County Office of Ed received in 2018 and to 2020. The Ways to Equity Playbook is available digitally, and I gave that link to you. We also have it on our website, which we will be sharing how to access it. It is intended as a navigational tool. Whenever you're starting work in equity, you say, where do I start? I don't even know where to start. What tools are out there? There's so much information. So we really wanted to put together a playbook that had individualized on-ramps, as we call them, for different uses, different student groups, different school sites. This can be used not only for a school district, but also a school site. And many of the tools in here, we've actually been using with staff within the SCCOE, the Santa Clara County Office of Education. It is to be used as a reflection guide. It's not a checklist. Originally, we were going to be developing an equity audit that could be utilized at the end of our CPIP grant, the equity grant, but we received feedback that the equity grant or an audit sounded kind of punitive, so we thought it would be best to change it to a playbook so that we could really individualize and tailor it for individual needs. Again, you can download for free. There are live links on it. And if you want to receive a hard copy, you can email inclusion@sccoe.org. Maybe Kelly, you can write that in for me. And it is a $20 cost per playbook at this point. So moving forward, we wanted to let you know that we didn't do this in isolation. There are many community organizations who actually supported and guided our equity playbook development that we put together. We worked very closely with the National Equity Project. They actually provided in-person, when we could be in person, different listening times, listening sessions with key stakeholders in our County Office of Ed, in addition to the districts that we worked with. We worked with the Western Educational Equity Assistance Center and Pivot Learning, Californians for Justice, and the Birts Equity and Inclusion Solutions, which Dr. Birts is our CEO for that. We had 4 different school districts participate, and then We encouraged them to write a case study on the different issues of equity that they looked at and used our playbook. And so I'd like to thank Alum Rock Union School District, Morgan Hill Unified School District, Oak Grove School District, and Mount Pleasant Elementary School District for supporting that. So it's really nice to have that in the document, because then you can actually see a little glimpse of what districts have done to use the playbook. So again, thanks to my amazing playbook equity warrior playbook warriors here who helped make sure that ensure all this happened. Working towards equity, we totally developed from the waste, the National Equity Project, what we really wanted to promote and support and name. So we promote inclusion, and we are the Inclusion Collaborative. So that is one of our main goals in life, is to make sure that all children are included and feel like they belong. We really like to remove the predictability of success and failure correlated with different ethnicity, race, and culture, and specific subgroups, social economic status also. And then we really want to pay attention to social and historical forces within the systems. Hearing from our populations that need the equity support is a critical factor, and those voices are part of your equity team at your sites. And so we'll be talking about that later, but that's a really integral part of the Ways to Equity Playbook. Again, the California Equity Performance Improvement Project program was the funding that we received from CDE. And we were looking at high academic achievement and other positive outcomes for all students on all achievement indicators, making sure we had equitable access to educational services and inclusion for all children, and then equitable treatment for all students. Our California Equity Performance Improvement Grant, we really focused on 3 different student groups, and those were African American students, English language learner students, and students with disabilities. And so they each have their own specific chapter, and we will be sharing that with you today. State system of support. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. It was developed a couple years ago, and both of the San Diego County Office of Ed and Santa Clara County Office of Ed were designated the equity leads. And we help coordinate and facilitate the state system of support. We provide resources and help leverage different resources for different needs as they come up, and people reach out to us still, even though our grant has finished, but we are still considered on the statewide system of support. This is the California One, which is the name we gave our CPIP project. And if you, we'll show you you'll be able to see it on our website, but if you envision California One, it connects north to south all the way through California. We had 3, we modeled it after MTSS. We wanted to have tier 1 that was very accessible. So we have online courses and coaching. Tier 2 was more of the face-to-face, and we had annual conferences and Equity Institute. And then tier 3 was more intensive and individualized, and that's where the Ways to Equity Playbook came in. And I'm now honored to be able to turn the next portion of this overview to my colleague, Kelly Wylie, who was very instrumental in getting this playbook off the ground. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Kathy. We have here for you an infographic that shows the schema of the playbook. It's a little challenging to read there in its intended format, so I'm going to uplift some of what that says for you. So we did take 5 key frames when we undertook the equity work. The first was systems change, excuse me. We wanted to make sure that we were understanding and taking action to advance equity in classrooms, schools, districts, and communities. Our methods were based in the continuous improvement strategies, as well as the multi-tiered system of support, the MTSS framework that you heard Kathy reference. It all begins with the assumption that inequities are systematic problems, and therefore equity is about changing the system in which we live. We wanted to make sure that everything in the playbook was versatile and adaptable to various contexts. It is not intended to be a checklist, and it's not a standardized one-size-fits-all strategy for addressing equity. It's really about the process, and the process is worthy of both the time commitment that's necessary as well as the engagement for carrying out your vision for equity. We wanted to make sure that collaboration and shared leadership were also at the forefront to make sure that stakeholders were across all groups and that we flattened the traditional hierarchical leadership arrangements. It was also extremely important to us that the data was humanized, that there was a story and a face behind every data point. By rooting in the practice of honestly listening to, raising up, and grounding student and community experiences in the work to advance equity. It promotes the idea that all statistical data are made up of multidimensional human experiences, and that this cannot be forgotten when we look at charts, tables, and numbers. And lastly, we took a targeted universalism approach, meaning that when we were presenting a roadmap for the reflection, it was coherent to all students within a specific student group. Like you heard Kathy mention, we did focus on 3: African-American students, English learners, and students with disabilities. However, the universal goals can be met for all students by focusing on how to achieve equity for those specific student groups, also stretch and do well for all students. Next slide, please. You heard Kathy mention that we worked closely with the National Equity Project. This happens to be their definition of student equity, and it was the definition that we adopted when we were formatting the playbook. So each student receives what they need when they need it to thrive social, emotionally, and academically. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Erica Boas.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Kelly. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is continue this high level view of the playbook, but really try to get you into the playbook itself, moving from that high level down into our kind of theory of change and student group work. So we started, as Kathy mentioned, this is a 2-year project, but we really started this project, the writing and development of this project in June 2019. And that began with a period of research, investigation, and ideation. While we simultaneously developed our core group of collaborators who would become our team and partner with us throughout. So toward the end of 2019, which feels like so long ago, we moved to an intensive multiple-month prototyping and editing, iterating and drafting and revising period that took the efforts of many to arrive at the final product that I hope you were able to access in September of 2020, which was our statewide rollout. So this right here is our timeline of work. And has been mentioned, we worked with the National Equity Project and engaged what they call a liberatory design framework. And so when I use words like ideation and iteration, I'm using the design language, the design principles that were brought to us by the National Equity Project. And the liberatory design approach is an approach to addressing equity challenges and change efforts in complex systems that's grounded in 3 core beliefs. And these beliefs are: 1, that racism and inequity have been designed into systems and can therefore be redesigned. 2, that designing for equity requires the meaningful participation of those impacted by inequity. And 3, that equity-driven designs require equity and complexity-informed processes. So you can't just say that you're doing equity and have inequitable processes that you use to support your equity project. And these are the core principles that can be found at the heart of the playbook. So next slide, please. So that brings us to what's in the playbook and the table of contents here. And let me take a look. You can't read it that well, but if you turn to that page of the playbook, you can see it much better. It gives you a really nice overview and outline of what's in our playbook. Here on the right-hand side, these bullet points highlight a few of our key sections. And the sections that we've pulled out for us to focus on here are how to use the playbook, our on-ramps, which I'm going to be talking about in a moment, the focal student groups that Dr. Birts and Villalobos will be taking you through, state dashboard indicators, which we felt was an important piece of the California work to engage in equity projects and activities, and universal design for learning, which is really kind of the theory that undergirds a lot of this work as well. I'm not going to have time to go into each of these, but if you have questions about these areas, you can please bring them up in the Q&A. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are some other areas of or parts of the playbook that you will, when you open the pages, you're going to find this. So for every section of the playbook, we have offered context. And by context, we mean definitions, history, and activities that will help you to understand some of the complex problems that we're trying to deal with, and some considerations for taking up these problems within the multifaceted context that we bring up here. We offer reflection questions for in every section, tools and resources, right? So tools are things you can really pick up and use in service of your work. Resources are going to help you further understand some of the problems and complexities that you are trying to navigate. And then we want to make a note of this, that in every section, we have a lot of rich text in our playbook, and we used a lot of research to develop our playbook. So because of that, and because of limited space, we've only been able to pull out some select references, but every reference we use in our playbook has a link that should take you to at least the summary of that research in another place. So next slide, please. So this is a roadmap of how we envision using the Ways to Equity playbook. And it should be said here that we, in addition to the different kinds of theories and philosophies that undergird this work, that the theory of kind of action that we use is a continuous improvement approach. So we tried to really use methods that are already being taken up in school systems, so that you are not having to learn lots and lots of new ways of going about doing things, that you can actually layer your equity work or the playbook onto work that's already being done. And so this roadmap shows the high level view of how teams might think about designing a trajectory for equity work using the playbook. And so I want to note that this process emerged from the liberatory design for complex systems work with MEP, and it reflects the idea that listening to stakeholders closest to the problem is essential if we are truly to understand how to solve the problems that we have inherited. So at the start of this process, you'll see that there's a core team in place that's working to define equity and taking the equity temperature using tools offered in the playbook. I also want to say that this question has come up. At the end of the playbook, one of the things that we also provide is a list of audits and assessments, some of them at no cost, some of them for cost, that can help you take that temperature, the equity temperature. So the findings of your initial investigation should be shared with multiple stakeholder groups to hear interpretations and insights on the findings. So diverse perspectives are necessary for truly engaging in equity work here and moving that work forward. And all of this information is then shared further with stakeholders who are invited in to collaborate in prioritizing equity needs and articulating the challenges that the local system, your local system, is facing. So when we say local system, we might be talking about a district, We may be talking about a school. We may be talking about a small school, right? But every part of that is every organism within a bigger system is a system in itself. So from there, equity teams work together to identify an equity problem of practice and decide on actions to take. And each of these steps can be informed and supported by use of the Ways to Equity Playbook. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, these are the on-ramps. So the on-ramps are starting places for where you might see yourself taking up the equity work. And we call these on-ramps because, you know, they're starting places, or they may be where you re-enter, knowing that at this point, schools and districts and county offices and other educational agencies may have been doing equity work for quite a while. So we have these different columns. Every column here is a different starting place. We have starting your engine for column 1, column 2 is picking up speed, and column 3 is merging onto the highway. We are trying to keep with the metaphor. That right-hand column in blue are the relevant sections of the playbook for each of the areas that we have organized the on-ramps around. So you'll see on the left-hand side, we have leadership development, teacher and staff development, data and research, planning, communication, culture and climate, and progress monitoring. And so what we really tried to do with this playbook, knowing that it was going to be, this is complex work, was organize something that was less complicated, that was very clear and user-friendly. So next slide, please. So to help you better understand what you might find in each of these on-ramps, we're zooming in on one area or one domain of the on-ramp. So here we have our first domain, which is planning. And you'll see that starting your engine, picking up speed, merging onto the highway, these 3 columns have different kinds of activities that are aligned with those columns. We envision the on-ramps as sort of a rubric or a checklist of sorts. We, as you know, we don't think of our playbook as a checklist, but we do know that checklists we use every day and they can be very helpful. So here you can see that if you're just starting your engine, if you feel that you're just starting out this work, the 3 things that you should think about doing are: 1, identifying and broadly defining equity challenges. What are the challenges you're seeing? Drafting equity goals that explicitly address inequities found in needs assessments that you conduct or audits that you conduct. And 3, developing a timeline starting with these on-ramps and cycles of continuous improvement. So if you, for example, thought that you were in column 2, you'd want to go back to that first column and make sure that you've done each of those things to best ensure that you are being as thorough as possible in understanding the work that needs to take place. Next slide, please. So the 3 pages that are highlighted here for you provide you with a visual of one playbook section. So this section is the section on implicit bias and cultivating equity-mindedness. We had a network meeting a couple months ago where we really went into this section. But every section, like this section, begins with an overview of the particular content area and follows with the definition of the key concept being presented. In this example, the implicit bias and cultivating equity-mindedness content area. And in each section, the author or authors drew from a variety of the most relevant or current research on the topic and provides a brief overview of the literature. We assume a practitioner audience in this playbook, but we know that practitioners are not the only people using this playbook at this point. And so, as you can see on this 3rd page, we have those tools and resources and references and reflection questions that I talked about earlier. Next slide, please. Okay, so the last slide that I'm going to be presenting before I hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Birts, is this. So we know that language is a huge part of how we're trying to engage equity work. I've heard since the publication of this playbook that language is an area that needs a lot of attention in the equity work, and a lot of times groups get kind of caught up in language and trying to calibrate around vocabulary. And so what we've done is given that this is a text-rich book, a text-rich document, we've tried our best to give you the most up-to-date definitions of each of the terms that we've used and really define our terms for accountability purposes, but also for use purposes. As mentioned, we have a set of equity audits and assessments and links to those equity audits and assessments that we hope people will use, because the playbook is not an audit. And then finally, something to mention, and Kathy talked about our district partners, is that we have 4 highlighted case studies that we thought would be important to illuminate the work that is already being done with some of these district partners around continuous improvement and equity work. So through their differentiated assistance work or through their focus on a student group, we really wanted to uplift these examples for the user, but also for those systems that are already doing really great equity work, to celebrate that and to really honor and value that work as well. So now I want to pass the presentation to Dr. Angela Birts, my colleague and co-author of the Ways to Equity Playbook.
Thank you, Erica. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Angela Birts, and I'll present a few slides on the framework as well as subgroups that we focus on. So to begin, if you look at the illustration here, for the Ways to Equity Playbook, we employ a systemic and systems approach to advance in equity. As you all know, that the work around equity grounded in different frameworks and theories is one catalyst for ensuring that you are pretty much aligned to what the empirical research and studies say around the topic of equity. So we are intending to show in this diagram how these 3 major areas of work that are highlighted in the playbook exist along a trajectory of continuous improvement. We designed the playbook as a continuous improvement approach to doing equity work. Specific content areas such as universal design for learning, social emotional learning, and culturally relevant pedagogy comprise about 1/4 of the total sections in the playbook. Next slide, please. The next few slides showcase the student groups and some of the content that you can find in the playbook that focus on those student groups. What you see here is information for the African American student group. That's the section in which I wrote, as well as culturally relevant responsive pedagogy. Again, they are students who are African American, students with disabilities, and students who are English learners. Each of the sections of the focal student groups outlines the following: a history of the inequitable policies and practices that have impacted these groups and how they have challenged these inequities, current statistics, and what tools, resources, and practices can be used to advance equity. In addition, the playbook offers explanation of the California dashboard indicators, using an equity lens to understand what these statistics mean with respect to student groups. Guidance is provided on how to address the inequities reflected in the statistics using an inclusive, positive, supportive, and systemic approach. So the slide that you see here illustrates some persistent issues, equity issues that African American students experience in school. So 3 here that are highlighted: African American students, for instance, are more likely to experience inequitable access to quality curriculum and instruction, receive less effective instruction regardless of the quality of the school, and experience bias and discrimination that also lead to expulsion, suspension, and so forth. So these are just a few of those equity challenges that are highlighted in this section. Next slide, please. So keeping in mind some of the challenges that I spoke of that African American students face, you're probably wondering or even thinking about your context that you're in. How do we address some of the inequities faced by African American students and students of color as a whole? One of our suggestions that we highlight in the playbook is to take seriously the tenets of what Gloria Lassing-Billings coined in her 1995 article, Toward a Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy. As I'm sure you all know, culturally relevant pedagogy acknowledges and utilizes the cultural and historical backgrounds, knowledge, and experiences of students to inform and fundamentally transform a teacher's classroom and a teaching methodology. Before we move to the next slide, I want to highlight that you could think of doing the work of CRP in three ways: at the district level, site level, and at the classroom level. And knowing what those tenets are, there's a section in the playbook where we highlight different tenets related to CRP and words that are often used interchangeably to talk about this particular framework. So you might have heard of culturally relevant pedagogy, but there's also culturally relevant teaching and other different words that are used that take on the same meaning. So those tenets are very important, particularly around addressing the equity issues and naming race as a factor in those challenges and the systemic history of oppression and racism for all of these groups. So that is one part of CRP that is not to be overlooked. Before reaching that classroom level, it's about having candid and courageous conversations about how those challenges have emanated and what you can do to address them using this toolbook or other resources you might have at your disposal. The next slide, please. So here are some examples. So on this slide here, these are promising implementation practices and tools included in the playbook that are particularly relevant for African American students. For instance, the algebra project comes from the work of Dr. Bob Moses, who worked at a school in the inner city and found how to make the topic and the subject of math relevant for his students, and then use that over a few years to then create a program that's still successful today, and also have students who were formerly in that program as a part of the leadership of the program. We offer through Santa Clara County Office of Education a course around culturally responsive anti-bias teaching. I mentioned those tenets of culturally relevant pedagogies and related frameworks that could be very useful in thinking about even how to grapple or navigate these different frameworks related to CRP and where your school, site, or district might fit into that. And then there's also some resources from the New York State Education Department around culturally responsive sustaining educational framework that are also provide some more examples of how you can use that at those different site levels. So I am now going to pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Ana Villalobos.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having us. The next student group that we're going to be discussing is students with disabilities. So this is another focal group in the Ways to Equity Playbook. So looking at the CAS data for students with disabilities and college and career outcomes, from looking at the data, it is apparent that students with disabilities perform at a much lower level and have poorer outcomes than their non-disabled peers. So students with disabilities are more likely to score lower levels on the CASP in both English language arts and literacy and mathematics. They graduate at a lower rate, and they meet UCCSU requirements at a lower rate than students without IEPs. Further compounding this problem, this inequity, is the continued segregation of students with disabilities in California who are systematically removed from the general education classroom as compared to their disabled peers across the nation. California has one of the worst rates of segregating our students with disabilities compared to the rest of the country. The recent move to online learning has further exacerbated these inequities. LEAs and schools who have striven to redesign equitable instruction for all students, but have particularly struggled with implementing effective instruction for students with disabilities. So the question is, how can the playbook assist LEAs, school sites, and classroom teachers to address these issues? As mentioned earlier, there are reflection questions in the playbook to support LEAs and educators that can be used at the district, site, and classroom levels. And you can find I don't know if Kelly already put it in there, but the student with disabilities section is on page 20 in the playbook. So after LEAs have had the opportunity to reflect on current systems and practices in place, they can then access the resources in the playbook to focus on and support their initiatives. We have a section also, which is on page 51 in the playbook, on educational technology and sample equity resources. For example, Advancing Equity in the Area of Crisis, a guide to equity in remote learning. Another one is the U.S. Office of Educational Technology Equity Grant. And then the Digital Promise, how access to technology can create equity in schools. This is of particular importance right now because of the distance learning that is going on, although many of our districts are now returning to hybrid or to in-person. There's still a lot of students who are still being taught through distance learning. So for many students with extensive support needs, their communication is through the use of technology for our students with disabilities. It may be through assisted technology or through an augmented communication device. If this isn't working correctly in distance learning, we are effectually, in effect, we are reducing the language of these students and we are reducing their voice. So it's very important to acknowledge this and to think about the educational technology that our students are using and how we can best support them. Because they may have limited access to these devices outside of the classroom. So this limits their ability to communicate, and their language, as I said before, is hindered. Next slide, please. So part of this, so how can we address this? There's a number of ways, but I want to talk about our third group, our third focal group, which are our English learners. Again, we offer a socio-political history of the group, data, and then a set of tools, resources, and activities that can be used in support of this group. And this section is on page 24 in the playbook. Although English learners constitute 19.3% of the students in the state of California, they do not necessarily constitute a large percentage of the students who graduate from high school and then continue on to higher education. The playbook focuses on the equity issues and opportunity gaps. I like to call them experience gaps faced by our English learners in academics, instruction, and their long-term educational outcomes. One of the major issues is the gap in the experience and opportunity gap in academic achievement. Over the last 5 years, more than 80% of EL students continue to perform at below standards on the ELA and math sections of the CAST. And as we all know right now, students with disabilities and our English learners are perhaps the two hardest hit groups because of distance learning and have lost a lot of ground. When speaking of equity, we need to look deeper into the data of our students. The data is not just numbers. Each data point represents a student. And I always try to remember that when I'm looking at data. Each one of those points represents a student. When we examine the intersectionality of students who are EL, we find that many have also been identified as having a disability and are socioeconomically disadvantaged. The California's Practitioner Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities reports that in 2017-18, overall, 12% of students in the state qualified for special education. However, 16.6% of EL students were identified as a student with a disability. In addition, 20% of ELs are identified as being socioeconomically disadvantaged. And I'm pretty sure that's gotten higher now with COVID-19, with the pandemic. Thank you. This next slide is on creating a culture of inclusion and belonging. And this is a section, one of my favorite sections in the playbook. It's on page 39. And you'll find resources to support LEA sites and educators that support their efforts in equity. And one of the main things, as we said earlier on, and as the continuing thread throughout all of this, is when we're looking at equity, how are we really making our students be part of, feel like they belong and have a culture of inclusion for everyone. So we have Teaching Tolerance, which has learning plans for diversity. And we also have scholastic lessons on multiculturalism, diversity, My Name, My Identity initiative, and the UC Berkeley Othering and Belonging Institute. And I believe, Kelly, are you the next one on, or did I miss a slide? Yes?
No, I'm next.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we threw a lot of stuff at you relatively quickly, and it's dense work. So how do you go about accessing it all when we're done today. It's relatively simple. Everything that we mentioned today, the playbook, the Inclusion Collaborative, all of the rich resources are available at www.sccoe.org. And there you will find our launch webinar that we did statewide with State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurman. You will also see the links to the Navigating Equity Network that we have that's meeting every third Thursday of the month. We have 2 left, April and May. We would love to see you there. So if you click on sccoe.org, you'll be taken, you'll see this landscape that Kathy mentioned of the California one on our carousel. You can click anywhere on that picture, the playbook, the highway, the California one symbol, and it will take you to the Inclusion Collaborative website. And there you'll be able to access the webinars, the equity institutes that you heard Kathy mention earlier. You can get a hard copy of your playbook. You can also download, if you haven't already today, the free digital copy that's there. The benefit, of course, to the digital copy is you have direct access to all the links. But because there are, it is such rich text, as Erica alluded to, it's nice to have a hard copy in your hand too and be able to mark it up. So you can find everything you will need at sccoe.org. Next slide. Kathy?
You're on mute.
No, it's so hard when you're trying to be a good little Zoom host here. Here we go. What's next? We really want to invite you to our Navigating Equity Network meetings that are every third Thursday from 10 to 12 in the morning. We have done them since November, and we have them all recorded with the PowerPoints on there if you'd like to see it. We've had between 20 and 80 people attend. We've had a couple folks that have attended every meeting because they're really working on equity, navigating equity within their districts. So I encourage you to look at it. We also have really modeled how you can use the tool and what else is in it. And links are provided, but we've done quite a few activities in certain different chapters that we use to share what we've done. So I really encourage you to do that. As we mentioned, the first tier of our California One initiative was online learning. And so we have our badges listed here. And I'll go ahead and show you, if you go back to the SCCOE website, like Kelly mentioned, and press the carousel and go to the Ways to Equity page on the Inclusion Collaborative, you can go to those online modules. All right, and one of them is specifically on CRP. We also have coaching and professional development. And as I mentioned, if you'd like a copy of the playbook, hard copy, please email inclusion@sccoe.org and we will send one to you. And they cost $20. All right, next here is, oh, I forgot to put the line through March 18th because this was supposed to be March 1st, but we've had March 18th and our next one will be April 15th. And what we're really excited about is that we have co-sponsored with the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, or CCEE. And so I encourage you to join. It's free. Anyone can come and you can look at the previous ones on our website. Now we are happy to take some questions and answers from you and see if someone has anything to ask our team while we're here.
Yeah, I'd like to, who is this? Thomas raised a question about the slide 27 on the culture of inclusion and the culture of belonging. I think one of the biggest problems with our students who, particularly our students who are students with disabilities is that we remove them from the classroom, which means we're removing them from the rigor and we're removing them from general education. And when we do that, not only are we segregating them, but we are not allowing them to participate in the level of curriculum and instruction that they need in order for them to be successful. So a lot of times I think about, instead of removing the student, we should be removing the barriers, which is why we talk about inclusion, which is why we talk about making a community and a culture of inclusion within a campus or within a school or within a district, so that people have an understanding that that those are not the students that we don't have to worry about and not educate and keep separate, that those are our students and they need to be in our classroom. So building that culture of inclusion and belonging is the first step in getting folks to realize that these are all of our students and that we need to educate all of our students. And then we start talking about different strategies for doing that, such as universal design for learning, and such as culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally sustaining pedagogy, if we're referring to our students who are EL, because our students who are EL, they have something that I wish I had, because I wasn't taught Spanish, even though both my parents were Spanish speakers, because that was a no-no. We didn't want you to learn that. I wish now that I spoke both Spanish and English. That would have been a big thing in my life and would have been a big thing in my career. And so that idea of sustaining and culturally relevant pedagogy is grasping onto those assets and those strengths that students need, and also the concept of sustaining what they have that are their strengths and not taking them away and being negative as something that is negative, that they speak a different language than English, that is actually additive in the long run and develops even larger parts of the brain and gives them a bigger cognitive load that they can handle. That's all part of that culture of the belonging and the inclusion. And a lot of that, when you go through the playbook, it becomes more and more apparent, that theme of how those things all work together. So, I think that I think someone is making a comment here about that UDL is Gen Ed. UDL started out being Gen Ed, and all these special ed people glommed onto it, but it was meant for the general education classroom. So I think that that's something yeah, UDL really needs to be present. But thank you that's a really good point that you make. And I hope I explained that a little bit.
Thomas, I'd invite you to explore on the Inclusion Collaborative website. One of the things that's offered are UDL micro-credentials. So if yourself and the teachers that you're working with are interested in, there are now 3 levels. They're in the process of a 4th level. So that's something we can help you with if you're looking to take UDL to a wider audience.
Any other questions or comments?
I agree, Thomas. Just hope. Yeah, hope is part of it. Yeah, hope is part of it, but we also have to do the work. Yeah, I would agree.
All right, it's 3:53. Corey, should we wait for more people to ask questions?
I think at this point, everybody's probably asked the questions they wanted to. If anybody thinks of any questions further on, I know there's contact information placed in the PowerPoint. You can also always reach out to me and I'll be happy to get those questions over to the team here. Oh, great. And you can always send your questions to inclusion@sccoe.org. So perfect. Excellent. Well, with
Thank
that,
you, everybody.
Thank you, Kathy and the team. Thank you guys all so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. Again, I will be sending out a recording of this webinar later today or tomorrow to all registrants.
Thank you, Shelley, for your amazing comment. I love that. Thank you. And Corey, would you like us to send you the PowerPoint too?
Yes, please. That would be great. A lot
Okay.
of people always ask me for that, so that would be great. And you just send it to me as a PDF. That'd be perfect.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Everybody
Please.
have a great day.
Please reach out if you have questions or comments.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.